This lesson is titled Working with Objects in PowerShell. It's a part of the VMware vSphere PowerCLI video training series. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the Windows PowerShell pipeline, going to show you how to examine objects in PowerShell, how to filter them, and how to export data. These skills apply to anything that you're doing in PowerShell, but they apply especially to PowerCLI. The pipeline in PowerShell is a linear process. It starts at the left and it goes to the right. It involves looping over a collection, and this is an automatic procedure. All you have to do is start with an object and pass it down the pipeline, and if there are multiple objects, they will get iterated over in turn. You can start with getting an object, and then process it, and then output the object. This is a pattern that you will use over and over again in PowerShell, and the key thing is the pipeline, which is represented in a script by the pipe character, which is on many keyboards above the return key. Let me show you how to examine objects in PowerShell, and we'll get into a demonstration in a minute, and we'll also cover the pipeline character. You can pipe objects to getMember to show available properties and methods. You can pipe them to format lists to examine the properties. And you can use the period operator to access those properties and methods. So let's get up a console and I'll show you what I mean. I have a PowerShell console here handy, and what I'm going to do is start by showing you how to pipeline multiple objects and process them. Let's start with a single commandlet in PowerShell called getVM. What I'm going to do is pipe this to setVM. Now setVM has multiple parameters, and I think I'm just going to use a simple example here, a description, and say this is a VM. Now this is an example of a pipeline. I start at the left, and then I'm processing something, and it goes through with this pipe character. Anything that spits out of getVM, which in this case is going to be these virtual machine objects, each one of them is going to be iterated over in turn. This collection of objects is going to be operated upon by this setVM commandlet. And if I hit enter, this is going to change the description of each of these virtual machines. Now before I do that, what I'm going to do is take these virtual machines and assign it to a variable. Okay, now I've got a virtual machine. I'm going to pipe it to getMember. GetMember is a very important commandlet in PowerShell, and you're going to use it a lot. It helps you learn more about the environment and learn how to write scripts and examine objects. So what I've done is I've taken this collection of virtual machine objects, piping them to getMember, and getMember will show me what they're made of. So first thing at the top here is we have the type name. This is the long programmatic description of what a virtual machine is called internally. So we can just call it the virtual machine object, though. That'll suffice. So each of these items in this list is called a member. A member can be one of several things. The most common items are either a method or a property. With PowerCLI in particular, you'll see a lot of properties. You won't see many methods. A property is going to be something that is a description of an object. So you can have a virtual machine that has CD drives, folder, it has a name, it has memory. So you can imagine how these basically just describe the object. So if I scroll up to my listing of virtual machines, you can see each of these across the top here. These, in fact, are the property names. So each column is representative of a property. And you can use getMember to examine these properties further. So for example, let's see, network adapters. I can also use getMember and say, just to pull out one of those things. So what else I want to do with a pipeline, I can pipe them to format list. Let's take this VM. Actually, we're going to start over getVM, and we'll say web. So this is one of my virtual machines. I'm going to pipe this to format list, And what this does is, instead of showing me the default table, I'm getting much of the same information, actually all the same information plus more, in a list format. So we've got the properties going down instead of across, and you can see much more detail than we saw in the first example in the table output. In fact, that table output is produced by the format table commandlet. And tables are usually going to be the default for many objects within PowerShell. And lastly, we can use the period operator to access properties and methods. So let's do this. I've got my VM, my web virtual machine. I'll assign that to the $VM variable. Now, it's the same thing. What if I want to access the name in a script? There it is, the power state. I have to type it correctly. Oh, 2 dots. Okay, so you can see how this works. We've got the ability to access any of these property names by typing a dot followed by the name of the property. And that's how you work with objects in PowerShell. Let's continue. Filtering objects. You can use other PowerCLI commandlets to filter results. Let me show you an example of what I mean. Let's start with get cluster. You know what a cluster is, right? It's a collection of resources. In this case, you're going to have multiple ESX servers typically in a cluster, and virtual machines are part of that cluster. Several things can be part of that cluster. You have resource pools in that cluster, and so on. So what you can do with PowerCLI is you can create a pipeline where you're starting with get cluster, pipe it to get VM host, pipe it to get VM, pipe it to get VM guest. And these objects happen to have a parent-child sort of relationship, so you can get down to different pieces of information. You can filter them down, and you can even use the where object commandlet, which is PowerShell, not PowerCLI. You can use where object to get even more specific. So I'll show you examples of both of these, but here's one for where object. For example, say that I want to find out which of my virtual machines have less than 1 gig of RAM. One way to do that is to use the where object commandlet. So we start with get VM and pipe that to where object, and then inside the curly braces you can see an operation here where we're taking $_ and that's going to stand for whatever object is coming through the pipeline at that moment. We're going to access the memory MB property, because I told you how we can use the period to access the properties, and we're going to determine, we're going to run this expression that says, is the memory less than, which is the -LT stands for less than, is it less than the number 1024? So what's going to happen is virtual machines are going to come through the pipeline, they're going to go through the where object commandlet, and they're going to be tested by whatever is inside of this script block. If the expression evaluates to true, then you will see a virtual machine object. If it evaluates to false, in other words, if my virtual machine has more than 1 gig of RAM, then you won't see that object. So low RAM, on the left here, we got the assignment operator. So low RAM will contain, it'll be a variable that'll contain only virtual machines that have less than 1 gig of RAM. Another couple of examples. First, we'll clear the screen. Now let's type in get cluster. See if I got one cluster. Let's pipe that to get VM host. And let's type that to get VM. Now in this case, I've basically, all I've achieved is getting every single virtual machine in my infrastructure. But let's say that I had, in this case, I've got 2 virtual machine hosts. So I just want to receive the information about one of them. So now I'm only going to get the portion of virtual machines which are on this first host. And I've basically used the pipeline to filter things down to a more narrow view of these objects. And one thing that I do a lot, for example, in where I work, I've got multiple clusters. We have production and non-production resource pools, and also have clusters in different data centers. So I could do, for example, get resource pool prod, pipe that to get VM, and that's going to show me all of my production virtual machines as opposed to, let's say, QA. Pipe that to get VM. That's going to show me all of my QA virtual machines. So very useful ability to be able to use filters and commandlets to narrow down the set of objects that you're working with. Now let's talk about exporting data. You can use the export CSV commandlet to write data to a file with comma-separated values. Everybody knows what a CSV is. They're actually really easy to generate from PowerShell, and of course it's easy to manipulate those in a spreadsheet app like Excel, and then perhaps produce the reports that you're going to hand off to someone else. So let me show you an example of this. So I've got my virtual machines here. I'll just hit up and pipe that to export CSV file, and I'm going to say no type information to omit a bit of information which I don't really care to have at the top. Oops, I made a typo there. Let's call this path. Okay, now what this is going to do is going to take all of the properties in the virtual machine and write those to CSV. Okay, let's examine this. Got a 14K file here. I'm going to use the invoke item. This is a PowerShell commandlet. PowerShell. No additional charge for that one. And basically, it's going to start the default application for the file that's associated with that extension. So as you can see here, I've got a lot of information, a lot of columns. Let's see if we can pretty this up a little bit. Okay, we've got power state, version, description, notes, guest, num CPU, and it goes on for many, many columns. Now, what if I wanted to create a report with only some of the information? I mean, this is a lot of stuff, and I can never see myself using this UID field, for example. So let's close this spreadsheet. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to hit up arrow once or twice here. Now I'm going to use the select object commandlet to pare down the information and select only the bits about it that I care. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this after get VM. Pipe this to select object, and I'm just going to type the name of the properties that I care about. So I'm going to scroll up a little bit, and I see name, power state, and num CPUs and memory. Now I happen to know that num CPU and memory are not the real names of these properties, and the key that threw me off here was that there's spaces in the property names, and while possible, that's not typical. So I'll show you how using the get member commandlet we can find out what the real property names are, but I know what they are, so I'll go ahead and type a couple here. Name, memory, and num CPU, and that'll do for now. Let's hit enter, and II is the alias for invoke item. We'll say file.csv, and you can see that we've pared this down to only the bits of information which I care about at this moment. Close that. Now let's say VM. Yep, there's my virtual machine. Pipe that to get member. Going to display only the properties. Now you can see here that we've got a lot of properties. I showed you this before, and for example, let's see, num CPU. Here's the name of the num CPU parameter. If we look up here, or property rather, see num space CPUs. Memory MB, it's memory space MB with parentheses there. That one's really called memory MB. That's working with export CSV. Now you can use the convert to HTML commandlet to convert objects to tables encoded in HTML. So let me show you that real quick. Let's take this same set of data here, and I'm going to take off the export CSV, and we'll replace it with convert to HTML. Hit enter, and what it's going to do is actually generate the HTML right here on the screen. which doesn't help me all that much. I'm going to need to write that to a file to make it very useful. So let's do that. Hit up arrow, pipe that to set content file.html. And I'm just going to hit a semicolon. That's going to end this current, it's going to execute this line of code, and I'm going to continue on with II file.html. So what this is going to do, it's going to produce this report, write it to HTML, write that HTML to a file, and then it's going to invoke that file. You can see here that it's going to take a few seconds to create the file, and here we have our HTML table with all the information we were looking for. So that's how you can create a very basic HTML table. And specifically when you're working with Power CLI, if you want to have pretty HTML reports containing information about your vSphere environment, I do think you should check out Power GUI, which is an application that you can download for free. And they've got lots of reporting capabilities built in, which they've taken care of some of the work involved in generating a nice, attractive report with, as you can see here, all these headings and nice default fonts and so forth. So that's something that'll save you a lot of time if you're interested in generating HTML reports. So what we've covered in this working with objects in PowerShell lesson, we talked about the pipeline. I explained how basically you start at the left and you go to the right, and these things move through the pipeline. These objects move through the pipeline. You can then examine them using the getMember commandlet, and you can filter these objects using either other commandlets or something like the where_object commandlet. And we also played with select_object. And lastly, export data. We talked about how you could convert to HTML or export to CSV.